Imagine a company that would one day conquer the most prestigious race on Earth. A company that would solve an engineering problem every automotive giant had declared impossible. A company that would build the only successful rotary engine in history and challenge the unstoppable titans of Detroit. Now imagine that empire was built not by a wealthy industrialist with elite connections, not by a brilliant engineer with university degrees, but by the 12th son of a poverty-stricken fisherman who couldn't even afford to send him to school. This is not a motivational fairy tale. This is not an exaggeration. This is the true story of Jujiro Matsuda and the company that bears his name, Mazda. And before we dive deep into this incredible journey of triumph against impossible odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Motor Chronicles, because the stories we uncover here will fundamentally change the way you see the automotive world forever. Now, before we continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Are you in Tokyo, Detroit, Berlin, Sao Paulo? I want to know who's joining us on this ride through one of the most inspiring stories in automotive history. August 8th, 1875. In the small fishing village of Mukanata, nestled on the outskirts of Hiroshima, Japan, a baby boy entered the world as the youngest of 12 children born to a struggling fisherman and his exhausted wife. His name was Jujiro Matsuda, and by every measure of the world he was born into, his future looked as bleak and predetermined as the poverty that surrounded him. His father worked the waters of the Seto Inland Sea, barely scraping together enough fish and income to feed his enormous family. There was no money for education, no inheritance waiting in some family vault, no path to prosperity that anyone could see. For young Jujiro, life seemed cruelly predetermined. Follow his father and brothers to the fishing boats, cast nets into the sea until his back broke and his hands bled, marry young, produce more children who would also become fishermen, and fade into obscurity like countless generations before him. But even as a young child, while his 11 older siblings learned to mend fishing nets and read the patterns of tides and weather, young Jujiro found himself captivated by something entirely different. He was obsessed with machines. In that remote fishing village where technology was scarce and modern industry seemed like something from another world entirely, the few mechanical devices that occasionally made their way to Mukanata held young Matsuda's attention with an intensity that bordered on obsession. While other children played games and dreamed of good catches and calm seas, Jujiro studied every gear, every lever, every moving part he could find. He would watch these machines for hours, taking them apart in his mind, understanding their principles, imagining how they could be improved. His family couldn't understand this strange fascination, but they couldn't deny the fire they saw burning in his eyes either. At 13 years old, most boys in Matsuda's desperate situation would have resigned themselves to their fate. They would have accepted the life of a fisherman, married a girl from a neighboring village, and perpetuated the endless cycle of poverty that had trapped their family for generations. The path was clear, the expectations were set, and questioning your predetermined role in society simply wasn't done in Meiji-era Japan. But Jujiro Matsuda made a decision that would echo through automotive history for over a century and change the lives of millions of people who would never even know his name. He left, at 13 years old, with no formal education, no money, and no connections. He abandoned the fishing village, said goodbye to his enormous family, and traveled alone to Osaka, Japan's industrial heartland. His destination? A blacksmith's workshop. His plan? To learn everything he possibly could about working with metal, machines, and fire. The life of a blacksmith's apprentice in Meiji-era Japan was nothing short of brutal, a test of physical endurance and mental fortitude that broke most young men who attempted it. Matsuda worked from before dawn until long after darkness fell. His young hands constantly blistered and burned from handling red-hot metal that could sear flesh in an instant. The forge was suffocatingly hot in summer, the air thick and difficult to breathe, while in winter it was barely warmer than the freezing streets outside. He slept in cramped, uncomfortable quarters with other apprentices, ate simple meals that barely kept him alive, and earned almost nothing for his backbreaking labor. Most apprentices counted the days until they could escape, dreaming of easier work and better conditions. But for Jujiro Matsuda, every hammer blow against glowing steel, every piece of metal he shaped with his bare hands, every technique he mastered through repetition and pain brought him one step closer to a vision that burned brighter than any forge. Years passed in that relentless cycle of work and learning. The scrawny 13-year-old boy with calloused hands grew into a skilled and respected machinist, someone whose expertise was recognized throughout Osaka's industrial community. He didn't just learn blacksmithing. He mastered it with an obsessive dedication that impressed even the most demanding masters. He studied every machine he encountered, taking them apart both physically and mentally, understanding their fundamental principles, identifying their flaws and limitations, and imagining how they could be revolutionized. He worked at prestigious naval shipyards in Kure and Sasebo, absorbing technical knowledge like a sponge absorbs water, learning from the best engineers in Japan. Every failure taught him something invaluable. Every success fueled an ambition that continued to grow. By his late 20s, Jujiro Matsuda had become one of the most skilled machinists in all of Japan, renowned for his precision work and innovative thinking. But he was still working for others, still taking orders from men who didn't share his vision, still watching his innovations and improvements benefit someone else's company and someone else's fortune. That was about to change in a way that would set the foundation for everything that followed. At 31 years old, with minimal capital but maximum determination, Jujiro Matsuda made his second life-defining decision. He rented a tiny, 33-square-meter cowshed in Osaka and founded Matsuda Saisakusho, his own workshop. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. It was literally a barn that had once housed cattle, with dirt floors and rough wooden walls. But it was his. For the first time in his life, the son of that poor fisherman from Mukanata was building something of his own, answering to nobody, betting everything on his own vision and abilities. The boy who had left fishing nets behind for the forge of a blacksmith was about to forge an empire that would one day challenge the automotive giants of Detroit and prove that the impossible is just another challenge waiting to be conquered. That tiny cowshed workshop in Osaka, barely 33 square meters of dirt floor and rough wooden walls, became Jujiro Matsuda's battlefield for the next several years. But to understand how he got there and what made him capable of building an empire from literally nothing, we need to rewind and understand the crucible that forged this man's character. Because between that 13-year-old boy who left his fishing village and the 31-year-old entrepreneur who dared to start his own company lies a story of relentless dedication, brutal working conditions, and the kind of obsessive focus that separates those who dream from those who achieve. The work of a blacksmith's apprentice in late 19th century Osaka was designed to break weak men and forge strong ones. Matsuda's days began before the sun rose and ended long after it had set. 12 to 14 hours of constant physical labor that left his young body exhausted and aching. The forge itself was a monster of heat and danger, a roaring furnace where temperatures climbed so high that the air shimmered and breathing became difficult. In summer, the workshop became almost unbearable, with apprentices collapsing from heat exhaustion while the master blacksmiths barely paused in their work. In winter, despite the blazing forge, the uninsulated workshop offered little protection from the freezing Osaka winds, and apprentices would shiver violently while handling tools and materials that could burn or freeze their skin with equal efficiency. Every day, Matsuda's hands would blister from gripping hammer handles and tongs. The blisters would burst, and then they would blister again. Burns were constant companions. Red angry marks on his forearms and hands where molten metal had splashed or red-hot steel had made contact. Most apprentices endured this torment while counting the days until they could escape to easier work, dreaming of softer jobs that wouldn't destroy their bodies before they reached 30. But Jujiro Matsuda was different in a way that his fellow apprentices couldn't quite understand. Where they saw endless suffering, he saw endless opportunity to learn. Every hammer blow he struck taught him something about how metal responded to force and heat. Every piece of steel he shaped revealed secrets about material properties and structural integrity. Every technique his masters demonstrated was immediately absorbed, analyzed, and memorized. Years passed in that relentless rhythm of fire, metal, and sweat. The scrawny 13-year-old with calloused hands grew into a lean, muscular young man whose reputation for precision work and innovative thinking began to spread through Osaka's industrial community. By the time he reached 20 years old, Matsuda had already opened his first small metalworking shop, a remarkable achievement for someone so young and with no family wealth or connections to support him. But this was just the beginning of his education in the machine industry that would consume his entire life. He took positions at the prestigious Kure and Sasebo naval shipyards, facilities where Japan was building its modern navy, and where the most advanced engineering and manufacturing techniques of the era were being employed. There, Matsuda didn't just work. He studied with the intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important examination of his life. At these shipyards, surrounded by enormous machinery and complex engineering challenges, Matsuda absorbed knowledge like a man dying of thirst drinks water. He studied every machine, every process, every innovation he encountered. When something broke down, he volunteered to help fix it so he could understand how it worked. When a new technique was introduced, he stayed late to practice it until he had mastered it completely. The engineers and supervisors noticed this hungry young machinist who asked endless questions and never seemed satisfied with partial understanding. Some saw potential, others saw obsession. They were both right. Jujiro Matsuda was obsessed with understanding the fundamental principles of machinery, and that obsession was the foundation of his enormous potential. By his late 20s, Matsuda had become one of the most skilled and respected machinists in all of Japan. Master craftsmen sought his opinion on difficult technical problems. Companies tried to recruit him with promises of good salaries and comfortable positions. But working for others, no matter how prestigious the company or generous the compensation, felt increasingly like a cage to Matsuda. He wasn't just absorbing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. He was building towards something, preparing for a moment when he would bet everything on his own vision and abilities. Every failure he witnessed taught him what to avoid. Every success he observed taught him what to pursue. And through it all, he was formulating ideas for innovations that could revolutionize the industries he worked in. Then, in 1906, at 31 years old, Jujiro Matsuda made his move. With minimal capital saved from years of careful work and even more careful spending, he rented that tiny cowshed in Osaka and founded Matsuda Saisakusho, his own workshop. The early days were exactly as brutal as you might imagine. He worked alone or with one or two hired hands, taking on whatever small jobs he could find to keep the workshop running and food on his table. Larger companies saw him as insignificant competition, too small to worry about and too inexperienced to succeed. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating Jujiro Matsuda. Matsuda had been developing an idea during his years at the shipyards, an improvement to water pump design that he believed could revolutionize efficiency. He poured months of work into developing a prototype, testing it obsessively, refining every component until it performed exactly as he had envisioned. The result was the exclusive patented Matsuda pump, a water pump design that was demonstrably superior to anything else available in the Japanese market. It consumed less power, required less maintenance, lasted longer, and cost less to produce than competing designs. When he introduced it to the market, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Orders began flooding into that tiny cowshed workshop. Within just a few years, that operation expanded from a cowshed into a proper factory. The factory expanded into multiple buildings. The workforce grew from one man working alone to employing 4,000 workers. Matsuda Works, as the company came to be known, wasn't just successful. It became a titan of Japanese industry. The company secured contracts to supply artillery fuses to the Russian Tsar himself, a testament to both the quality of their precision manufacturing and Matsuda's growing reputation. The poor fisherman's son from Mokanata had achieved what most people would consider impossible, rising to become one of the most respected and wealthy industrialists in Japan. But here's something that Matsuda himself would later reflect on with the wisdom that only comes from looking back on a life fully lived. Success, he discovered, brings its own set of challenges and complications that poverty never prepares you for. And the greatest challenge was about to arrive in the form of partners, investors, and co-owners who didn't share his vision and would ultimately force him to make a choice that would cost him everything he had built. The exclusive patented Matsuda pump wasn't just a successful product. It was a revolution in efficiency that transformed Japanese industrial water management and made Jujiro Matsuda's name synonymous with innovation and quality throughout the nation. Within just 2 years of introducing his superior pump design to the market, that tiny cowshed workshop in Osaka had evolved into a sprawling industrial operation that bore almost no resemblance to its humble origins. Orders poured in from factories, shipyards, and industrial facilities across Japan, each one recognizing that Matsuda's pump was simply better than anything else available. The tiny workforce of 1 or 2 hired hands exploded into hundreds, then thousands of skilled workers who took pride in manufacturing products that carried the Matsuda name. By 1906, Matsuda Works had become one of the most respected industrial manufacturers in all of Japan. The company employed nearly 4,000 workers, operated multiple factory buildings across Osaka, and had secured contracts that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Among those contracts was one that demonstrated just how far the fisherman's son from Mukanata had risen, supplying precision-manufactured artillery fuses to the Russian Tsar himself. Think about that for a moment. A man who had been born into poverty so severe that his family couldn't afford to send him to school was now manufacturing military components for one of the most powerful empires on Earth. He had money, influence, a thriving business empire, and the respect of Japan's industrial elite. But here's where the story takes a turn that history loves to serve up with cruel irony. Success, Matsuda was about to discover, brings complications that poverty never prepares you for. As his company had grown, he had been forced to bring in partners, co-owners, and investors to fund the rapid expansion that the market demanded. These men, wealthy industrialists and businessmen who had never struggled for anything in their comfortable lives, saw Matsuda Works as nothing more than a profitable investment generating excellent returns. They were content to maintain the status quo, to keep manufacturing the same successful products in the same locations, to count their money and avoid any risk that might threaten those steady profits. They didn't understand the restless ambition that had driven a 13-year-old boy to leave his family and learn blacksmithing in a distant city. Jujiro Matsuda, despite all his success and wealth, couldn't simply stand still and admire what he had built. The boy who had abandoned everything to chase his dreams in Osaka decades earlier was still alive inside the successful industrialist, and that boy had unfinished business. Matsuda developed a vision for expansion that centered on one place that held deep emotional significance for him: Mukanata, the impoverished fishing village where he had been born as the 12th son of a struggling fisherman. He wanted to build a factory there, to bring jobs and prosperity and modern industry to the place that had given him nothing but hunger and hardship. It was personal. It was emotional. It was about giving back to the community that had watched him grow up in poverty. And to his business partners, it was absolutely, utterly unacceptable. The opposition was immediate and fierce. His co-owners, these comfortable men who had never known real poverty or struggle, saw Mukanata as nothing more than a worthless backwater with no industrial infrastructure, no pool of skilled workers, and no strategic advantage whatsoever. They saw Matsuda's proposal as sentimental foolishness, an emotional decision that would drain valuable resources from their profitable operation and expose the company to unnecessary risk. Arguments erupted in boardrooms. Disagreements turned into battles. Battles escalated into an all-out war for control of the company that Matsuda had built from absolutely nothing. The man who had created this empire, who had designed the revolutionary pump that made it all possible, who had worked himself nearly to death to transform a cowshed into an industrial powerhouse, suddenly found himself fighting for control against men who had contributed nothing but money. When the smoke finally cleared from that corporate war, the outcome was devastating. Jujiro Matsuda, the founder and visionary who had built Matsuda Works from a 33-square-meter cowshed into an empire employing 4,000 workers, found himself forced out of his own company, betrayed by the very partners he had brought in to help the business grow, ousted from the boardroom like an employee who had outlived his usefulness, stripped of the company that bore his own name and represented decades of backbreaking work and innovation. The psychological blow would have destroyed most men completely. To be thrown out of your own creation, to watch partners you trusted take control of everything you had built, to see your name above the door of a company you could no longer enter. This was a betrayal that would crush even the strongest spirit. But if there's one lesson you should take away from Jujiro Matsuda's story, it's this. The man simply did not know how to quit. Where most people would have wallowed in bitterness and anger, perhaps seeking revenge or legal recourse, Matsuda did what he had always done when faced with adversity. He adapted, he pivoted, he found a new path forward, and that path led him into one of the most profitable and morally complex industries of the early 20th century: arms manufacturing. The world was arming itself for conflicts that everyone could see coming, and nations desperately needed precision-manufactured weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Matsuda had the technical expertise, the manufacturing knowledge, and the business connections to supply exactly what they needed. His new ventures focused on producing military equipment, components, and supplies for the Japanese military and foreign governments. The contracts were extraordinarily lucrative, far more profitable than the water pumps that had made him wealthy the first time. Money poured in at a rate that would have seemed impossible during his first success. By his mid-40s, Jujiro Matsuda had not only rebuilt his fortune but had actually exceeded his previous wealth. He opened Hiroshima Matsuda Saisakusho back in his home region, returning as a conquering hero, a self-made industrialist who had risen from poverty to wealth not just once, but twice. He had proven to everyone, including himself, that the betrayal had not broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger and more determined. But fate, as it so often does in the lives of extraordinary people, had one more twist waiting for him. And this twist would set him on the path toward automotive history and the creation of one of the most innovative car companies the world would ever see. In 1921, 46-year-old Jujiro Matsuda received an unusual proposition that would have made any sensible businessman laugh and walk away immediately. A failing company in Hiroshima called Toyo Cork Kogyo Company Limited was on the verge of complete bankruptcy, drowning in debt and hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Its creditors were desperately seeking someone with the business acumen, financial resources, and perhaps foolish courage to take over the company and save it from total collapse. The company manufactured artificial cork products, and business had been excellent during World War I when international trade was disrupted and Japan needed domestic alternatives to imported natural cork. But the war had ended. International trade had resumed with a vengeance. Cheap, high-quality natural cork was flooding back into the Japanese market from Portugal and Spain, and suddenly nobody wanted expensive, inferior artificial cork anymore. The company was in a death spiral. Debts mounted daily. Customers canceled orders and switched to cheaper imported alternatives. Workers feared for their jobs and their families' futures. Every sensible businessman in Hiroshima had already been approached with the offer to take over Toyo Cork Kogyo, and every single one of them had declined immediately after reviewing the financial records and market conditions. It was, by any rational measure, a terrible investment that would likely consume whatever capital you poured into it and leave you bankrupt alongside the company itself. So naturally, the creditors approached Jujiro Matsuda, the man who had spent his entire life doing things that others considered impossible or insane. But to understand why Matsuda even considered this offer, and why he ultimately accepted it despite the obvious risks, we need to understand where he was in his life at that moment. The betrayal that had forced him out of Matsuda Works years earlier still burned in his memory, a wound that had never fully healed despite his subsequent success in arms manufacturing. He had rebuilt his fortune through military contracts, yes, and he had even exceeded his previous wealth. He had opened Hiroshima Matsuda Saisakusho in his home region, returning to Hiroshima as a conquering hero and successful industrialist. But something was missing. The work didn't satisfy him the way building Matsuda works had satisfied him. Arms manufacturing was profitable, but it lacked the creative challenge and innovative spirit that had defined his earlier success. There was also the matter of his age and legacy. At 46 years old in 1921, Matsuda was entering the stage of life where men begin thinking seriously about what they will leave behind, what their life's work will mean after they're gone. He had proven he could build successful companies and accumulate wealth, but he wanted something more meaningful. He wanted to contribute to society in a way that went beyond manufacturing weapons for conflicts that killed young men. The idea of transforming a failing company into something successful, of bringing jobs and stability to workers facing unemployment, of building something in his home region of Hiroshima that would outlast him, all of this appealed to something deep in Matsuda's character. So in 1921, despite the obvious risks and against the advice of nearly everyone who cared about him, Jujiro Matsuda officially took over as president and director of Toyo Cork Kojo Company Limited. He immediately began implementing his vision with the same relentless energy he had brought to every previous challenge. He shifted the company's focus from generic artificial cork products to compressed cork boards, a higher quality product that could actually compete in the market on the basis of performance rather than just price. He streamlined operations, cut unnecessary expenses, and invested in better manufacturing processes. His business instincts, honed over decades of experience, proved sharp as ever. Within a remarkably short time, he had turned the struggling cork company profitable. Workers who had been preparing resumes and fearing unemployment suddenly had job security again. Creditors who had expected to write off their loans as losses began receiving payments. It looked like Matsuda had pulled off yet another impossible comeback. But then, on a catastrophic day in 1925, disaster struck with devastating force that would test even Jujiro Matsuda's legendary resilience. A massive fire erupted in the Toyo Cork Kojo factory, spreading with terrifying speed through the wooden structures and highly flammable cork materials. The flames consumed everything in their path, growing into an inferno that could be seen for kilometers. Workers tried desperately to fight the blaze and save what they could, but the fire was simply too powerful and too fast. When the flames were finally extinguished hours later, 70% of the entire facility had been reduced to smoldering rubble and twisted metal. Buildings that had stood for decades were now just ash and charred beams. Machinery that represented years of investment was destroyed beyond repair. But far worse than any property damage was the human cost that would haunt Matsuda for the rest of his life. Employees, workers who had trusted him and believed in his vision for the company, lost their lives in the inferno. The exact number varied in different accounts, but even one death was too many for Matsuda to bear. He stood in the ashes of what should have been his redemption story, staring at the charred remains of the factory, grappling with grief for the workers who had died and crushing financial responsibility for the survivors who were looking to him for answers, for hope, for a future. The insurance wouldn't cover everything, not even close. The creditors, who had just begun receiving payments and believing the company might survive, were circling again like vultures sensing death. The workers who had survived the fire were gathering outside the ruined factory, looking to Matsuda for some sign that their jobs still existed, that the company would continue, that their families wouldn't starve. This was the moment. This was the crucible that would define Jujiro Matsuda's entire legacy and determine whether his name would be remembered or forgotten. And as he stood there in those ashes, surrounded by destruction and death and crushing debt, he made a decision that would change automotive history forever. He would rebuild, but this time he would rebuild as something completely different. Standing in the smoldering ruins of the Toyo Cork Kojo factory in 1925, 50-year-old Jujiro Matsuda faced a choice that would define not just the rest of his life, but the future of an entire industry he hadn't even entered yet. The fire had taken everything. 70% of the facility reduced to charred rubble, the lives of workers who had trusted him, and nearly all the capital he had invested in saving the company from bankruptcy. The creditors who had just begun to believe the company might survive were demanding immediate payment. The workers who had survived the inferno were gathered outside the ruins, looking to him with desperate eyes for answers he didn't have. Any reasonable person would have walked away, declared bankruptcy, collected whatever insurance money might be available, and retired on the wealth he had accumulated from his arms manufacturing ventures. But Jujiro Matsuda had never been reasonable, and he certainly wasn't about to start being reasonable at 50 years old. Instead, standing there in those ashes with the acrid smell of burned cork and with still hanging heavy in the air, he made a decision that seemed completely insane to everyone around him. He would rebuild. Not just rebuild the factory to manufacture more cork products in a dying industry, but rebuild the entire company with a completely new vision and direction. The cork business was dying anyway, strangled by cheap natural cork imports flooding back into Japan from Portugal and Spain now that World War I had ended and international trade had resumed. Matsuda realized that the fire, as devastating and tragic as it was, had given him something unexpected and valuable. A clean slate and the perfect excuse to pivot away from a failing industry into something he had always loved since he was that 13-year-old boy watching machines in his fishing village. Machines, metal, manufacturing, the very foundations of his identity as that blacksmith's apprentice decades ago in Osaka. This was what Matsuda knew, what he loved, what he had built his first fortune on before partners betrayed him. He renamed the company Toyo Kogyo, deliberately and symbolically dropping the word cork from the title entirely. It was a declaration that they were moving forward into a new era, that the past was literally burned away and the future would be built on different foundations. He refocused the entire operation on metalworking and machine manufacturing, leveraging all the expertise and knowledge he had accumulated over more than 40 years in various industries. Workers who had feared permanent unemployment suddenly found themselves part of something revolutionary, something that felt like it had real potential for the future. The factory was rebuilt over the following months and years, not as it had been but better, more modern, more ambitious. Matsuda poured his personal fortune and his soul into the reconstruction, working alongside his employees with the same relentless energy he had brought to that blacksmith's forge as a teenager. He drove them forward with his unshakable vision and absolute refusal to accept defeat. But rebuilding a factory and finding a profitable market for your products are two very different challenges. And Matsuda knew he needed more than just facilities and workers. He needed a product with real demand, something that could make Toyo Kogyo not just survive but thrive in a competitive industrial landscape. And then, as if the universe decided to reward his perseverance with perfect timing, opportunity arrived in the most tragic form imaginable. On September 1st, 1923, 2 years before the Toyo Cork Kogyo fire, the Great Kanto earthquake had struck Japan with apocalyptic force. The massive 7.9 magnitude earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, Japan's two largest cities, killing over 100,000 people and reducing vast sections of both metropolitan areas to rubble. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in minutes. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build was destroyed in seconds. In the aftermath, as Japan began the monumental task of reconstruction, something remarkable happened that would create the opportunity Matsuda had been searching for. The nation suddenly recognized the critical importance of motorized transportation in ways it never had before. Horse-drawn carts and traditional rail lines had been destroyed in the earthquake and subsequent fires. The roads were damaged but still passable with the right vehicles. What Japan desperately needed was affordable, reliable motor vehicles that could navigate the chaotic post-earthquake landscape, transport supplies and materials, and help rebuild the shattered infrastructure of the nation's industrial heartland. Traditional four-wheeled automobiles existed, but they were expensive luxury items imported from Europe or America, far beyond the financial reach of the average Japanese business or worker who needed basic transportation. The market was literally screaming for something different, something cheaper, something practical that could serve real needs rather than just status symbols for the wealthy. Matsuda heard that scream, and with his decades of manufacturing experience and deep understanding of what Japanese industry needed, he knew exactly what to build. Three-wheeled motorized trucks. These vehicles occupied a perfect market niche that nobody else was adequately serving. They were more stable and powerful than motorcycles, could carry substantial cargo that motorcycles couldn't handle, and were far more affordable than traditional four-wheeled automobiles. They required less material to manufacture, consumed less fuel, were easier to maintain with basic mechanical knowledge, and could navigate narrow Japanese streets that larger vehicles struggled with. But here's where Matsuda's story diverges sharply from his competitors and reveals the true depth of his vision and the lessons he had learned from decades of experience. While other Japanese manufacturers rushed to meet the surging demand by importing engines and critical components from overseas suppliers, essentially becoming assembly operations rather than true manufacturers, Matsuda refused to take that easy path. He insisted on designing and manufacturing as many components as possible in-house, building a vertically integrated operation that would give Toyo Kogyo complete control over quality, innovation, and production costs. It was a massively risky decision that required enormous capital investment, extensive research and development, and years of patient work before seeing any significant return on investment. His engineers thought he was being unnecessarily stubborn and perfectionist. His investors worried he was wasting precious time and money while competitors were already capturing market share with their assembled vehicles. But Matsuda understood something they didn't, something he had learned from building and losing companies. Long-term dominance requires short-term sacrifice. The foundation of an empire isn't built on shortcuts and imported components. It's built on innovation, quality, and the courage to invest in your own capabilities, even when everyone tells you you're crazy. Jujiro Matsuda spent the next several years working intimately with his engineering team, poring over designs with the obsessive attention to detail that had defined his entire career. The workshops at Toyo Kogyo ran day and night, the sound of hammering metal and roaring machinery echoing through the Hiroshima facility. Matsuda, now in his mid-50s, worked with the same relentless intensity he had brought to that blacksmith's forge as a 13-year-old apprentice 4 decades earlier. The boy who had left his fishing village to learn metalworking had never truly left that forge. He was still there, hammering away, shaping metal and machines, refusing to accept anything less than perfection. Failure after failure taught them what didn't work, and Matsuda insisted they learn from every single setback. Each failed prototype was analyzed, dissected, and transformed into knowledge that brought them incrementally closer to success. The engine design was refined dozens of times, with engineers testing different configurations, materials, and manufacturing processes. The suspension system was completely reimagined to handle Japan's rough roads and heavy cargo loads. The cargo capacity was maximized while keeping the overall weight manageable and the manufacturing costs reasonable. Every single detail mattered to Matsuda, from the angle of the handlebars to the thickness of the steel frame, and he made absolutely certain his engineers understood that they weren't just building a product for profit. They were building a reputation that would define the company for generations. His engineers sometimes thought he was being unnecessarily stubborn and perfectionist, pushing for improvements that seemed marginal at best. His investors worried openly that he was wasting precious time and money while competitors who had taken shortcuts were already capturing market share with their hastily assembled vehicles. But Matsuda had learned painful lessons from his decades in business, lessons written in betrayal and fire. He understood something that impatient investors and corner-cutting competitors would never grasp. Long-term dominance isn't built on shortcuts and compromises. It's built on innovation, uncompromising quality, and the courage to invest in your own capabilities, even when everyone around you is calling you crazy. Finally, in 1931, after years of obsessive development, relentless testing, and countless refinements, Toyo Kogyo was ready to introduce their masterpiece to the Japanese market. The vehicle they unveiled was called the Mazda-Go, a name that was a stroke of absolute brilliance and revealed Matsuda's understanding of branding and market positioning. The name was derived directly from Matsuda's family name, but with a clever twist in pronunciation that made it more accessible and memorable to Japanese consumers. It honored the founder while creating something new, connecting the company's past to its future in a single elegant word. Want to know something interesting about that name? It also happened to resemble Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian god of light and wisdom, though whether this connection was intentional or a fortunate coincidence remains debated by historians to this day. The Mazda-Go itself was everything Jujiro Matsuda had promised it would be and more. It was compact enough to navigate narrow Japanese streets that had been designed centuries before anyone imagined motorized vehicles. It was powerful enough to carry substantial cargo loads that would make it genuinely useful for businesses rebuilding after the earthquake. It was reliable in ways that competing vehicles assembled from imported parts simply couldn't match, because every component had been designed and manufactured to work together as a complete system. And perhaps most importantly for the target market, it was affordable, priced within reach of the average Japanese business owner who needed transportation but couldn't justify the enormous expense of a traditional four-wheeled automobile. The response from the Japanese market was immediate, overwhelming, and frankly beyond even Matsuda's optimistic projections. Businesses across Japan recognized the Mazda-Go as exactly what they had been desperately needing. Orders flooded into Toyo Kogyo's headquarters at a rate that strained the company's manufacturing capacity. Production lines that had been built in the ruins of a cork factory, on the ashes of tragedy and disaster, were now manufacturing thousands of three-wheeled trucks that bore the Mazda name proudly across their distinctive bodywork. The factory expanded rapidly, hiring more workers, installing more equipment, increasing shifts to meet the insatiable demand. Within just a few years, the Mazda-Go had become ubiquitous on Japanese streets, as common a sight as bicycles and far more useful for commercial purposes. Delivery companies relied on them. Construction firms used them to transport materials and tools. Small businesses found them indispensable for daily operations. The Mazda name became synonymous with reliability, quality, and that uniquely Japanese spirit of never surrendering in the face of impossible odds. The fisherman's son from Mukanada, who had been born into poverty so severe his family couldn't afford his education, had done it again. He had transformed catastrophe into opportunity, cork into chrome, and a dying company into an automotive powerhouse that was reshaping Japanese transportation. But this was just the beginning of the Mazda story. The foundation had been laid with the Mazda-Go. The reputation had been established. The manufacturing expertise had been developed. The company name was now known throughout Japan as a symbol of innovation and quality. Jujiro Matsuda had proven that he could build successful companies from nothing not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time rising from ashes and adversity to create something that changed industries. And the lessons he instilled in his company, the culture of relentless innovation and refusing to accept impossible, would define Mazda for the next century and lead them to challenges and triumphs that even Matsuda himself could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. On March 27, 1952, Jujiro Matsuda passed away at the age of 76, having lived long enough to see his company transform from a failing cork manufacturer into one of Japan's most innovative automotive companies. He died knowing that the Mazda name was synonymous with quality, innovation, and that indomitable spirit of refusing to accept impossible that had defined his entire life. But his death came just 7 years after an event so catastrophic, so world-changing, that it would forever define his hometown and test whether the company he had built could survive the unimaginable. The story of that survival and what came after is perhaps the most remarkable chapter in Mazda's already remarkable history. August 6, 1945. At 8:15 in the morning, the atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, releasing the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT and temperatures that reached several thousand degrees Celsius. The explosion instantly vaporized everything within a radius of 1 kilometer from the hypocenter and reduced the city to flaming rubble extending for kilometers in every direction. Over 140,000 people would die by the end of that year from the immediate blast, the firestorm that followed, and the radiation poisoning that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Hiroshima, the city where Jujiro Matsuda had been born 70 years earlier, where he had built his automotive empire, where thousands of workers depended on Toyo Kogyo for their livelihoods, had been effectively erased from existence in a single blinding flash. The Toyo Kogyo factory stood approximately 5 kilometers from the hypocenter of the blast, close enough to suffer significant damage but far enough to avoid complete destruction. The shock wave shattered windows, damaged buildings, and injured workers who happened to be at the facility that terrible morning. But by some combination of geography, building construction, and sheer luck, the factory's core infrastructure survived. More importantly, many of the workers survived, though they would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath, as Hiroshima burned and survivors stumbled through radioactive rubble, searching for loved ones, the question wasn't whether Toyo Kogyo would continue manufacturing vehicles. The question was whether there would be a city left to manufacture them in. But here's where the spirit that Jujiro Matsuda had instilled in his company revealed its true power. While other companies in devastated cities across Japan struggled to restart operations, while manufacturers waited for government assistance or international aid, Toyo Kogyo made a decision that seemed insane to outside observers. Just 3 months after the atomic bombing, in November 1945, the company restarted production. 3 months after a nuclear weapon had devastated the city, with radiation still contaminating the area, with infrastructure destroyed and resources desperately scarce, Toyo Kogyo workers returned to damaged factory buildings and began manufacturing vehicles again. It was an act of defiance against destruction itself, a declaration that Hiroshima would not die, that the company Matsuda had built would not surrender to even atomic fire. The vehicles they produced in those early post-war years were crude by previous standards, cobbled together from whatever materials could be found or salvaged, but they represented something far more valuable than transportation. They represented hope. They represented the indomitable human spirit that refuses to accept defeat even in the face of apocalyptic destruction. Every Mazda vehicle that rolled out of that damaged factory was a middle finger raised to the forces that had tried to destroy the city. And Japan, desperate for any form of transportation to aid in reconstruction efforts, needed those vehicles more than ever before in the nation's history. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Toyo Kogyo focused on rebuilding alongside Hiroshima itself, manufacturing the three-wheeled trucks that had made the company successful while gradually expanding their capabilities and expertise. Jujiro Matsuda remained actively involved in the company until his death in 1952, having witnessed both the atomic destruction and the beginning of the city's resurrection. His adopted son-in-law, Tsuneji Matsuda, took over leadership and brought fresh vision to the company's direction. Tsuneji understood that while three-wheeled trucks had built the company's reputation and served Japan's immediate post-war needs, the future belonged to passenger cars that could serve the growing middle class. In 1960, 15 years after atomic fire had nearly destroyed everything, Toyo Kogyo introduced the R360 Coupe, their first true passenger car designed for the mass market. It was a tiny two-door vehicle with a 356 cubic centimeter engine, barely larger than a motorcycle engine, but it was affordable, reliable, and perfectly suited for Japan's narrow streets and growing population of first-time car buyers. The R360 became an instant sensation, selling over 65,000 units and establishing Mazda as a serious passenger car manufacturer. The company that had risen from cork factory ashes and survived atomic destruction was now competing with established automakers on their own terms. But the leadership at Toyo Kogyo, inspired by Jujiro Matsuda's legacy of attempting the impossible, wasn't interested in being just another car company manufacturing conventional vehicles with conventional engines. They had survived things that should have destroyed them multiple times. They had built a reputation on innovation and refusing to accept limitations. And as the 1960s progressed, they began looking at a radical engine technology that every other major manufacturer had investigated and abandoned as commercially unviable. They were about to make a bet that would either cement their legacy as automotive pioneers or destroy the company Jujiro Matsuda had built from nothing. The rotary engine revolution was about to begin. In 1957, a German engineer named Felix Wankel developed a radical new type of internal combustion engine that threw out over a century of conventional piston engine design and promised to revolutionize automotive propulsion. Instead of pistons moving up and down in cylinders like every engine since the dawn of the automobile age, Wankel's revolutionary design used a triangular rotor spinning inside an oval-shaped housing. The concept was brilliant in its elegant simplicity and promised advantages that piston engines could never match. Fewer moving parts meant less weight and reduced mechanical complexity. Reduced vibration meant smoother operation. Higher power output relative to size meant you could fit more power in smaller vehicles. And the compact dimensions opened up entirely new possibilities for vehicle design and weight distribution. Every automotive engineer who saw the Wankel engine recognized it immediately as potentially the future of propulsion, the dream engine that could change everything about how automobiles were designed and manufactured. But there was one catastrophic problem that turned that beautiful dream into an engineering nightmare that terrified every manufacturer who attempted to develop it. The apex seals, the critical components that maintained compression as the triangular rotor spun inside the housing, would fail catastrophically and rapidly. They would wear down at alarming rates, creating what engineers called chatter marks, distinctive grooves carved into the housing's inner surface by the degrading seals. Once those marks appeared, the engine's compression would drop dramatically, power would plummet, fuel consumption would skyrocket, and complete catastrophic failure was inevitable. It was a death sentence for any engine, and nobody could solve it. General Motors, the largest automobile manufacturer in the world with virtually unlimited resources and some of the best engineers on the planet, investigated the Wankel engine extensively and quickly abandoned it as commercially unviable. Mercedes-Benz, with all their legendary German engineering prowess and decades of automotive innovation, tested it thoroughly and walked away shaking their heads. NSU, the German company that had licensed the technology directly from Felix Wankel himself and had the closest relationship with the inventor, managed to produce rotary-powered vehicles but suffered such devastating reliability problems that it would eventually destroy the company's reputation and lead to its absorption by Volkswagen. Approximately 100 companies worldwide had initially scrambled to license the rotary engine technology when NSU announced it in 1959. Within a few years, nearly all of them had abandoned their development programs. Every rational analysis by every major manufacturer concluded the same thing. The Wankel rotary engine was a brilliant concept with insurmountable practical problems that made mass production impossible. Then, in July 1961, Toyo Kogyo signed a licensing agreement with NSU to develop and manufacture Wankel rotary engines. When news of this decision spread through the international automotive industry, the reaction ranged from polite skepticism to outright ridicule and mockery. Competitors who had already abandoned rotary development watched with bemused interest, convinced that Toyo Kogyo was about to waste enormous resources on an impossible project that would likely bankrupt the company. Financial analysts openly questioned whether Toyo Kogyo was risking its entire future on unproven technology that every major manufacturer had already declared unworkable. Even within Toyo Kogyo itself, many engineers and executives privately worried that the company had made a catastrophic strategic mistake that could undo everything Jujiro Matsuda had built. But the company's leadership, particularly President Tsuneji Matsuda, who had taken over after Jujiro's death, was inspired by the founder's legacy of turning impossible challenges into triumphs. They refused to be intimidated by the failures of larger, wealthier competitors. When the first prototype rotary engine arrived in Hiroshima from NSU, testing began immediately with tremendous excitement and anticipation. Unfortunately, within the first hour of running, the engine seized completely, confirming everyone's worst fears. Toyo Kogyo had wagered its entire existence on this one revolutionary engine technology, and the early results suggested they had made a terrible mistake. But failure simply wasn't an option, not for a company that had survived betrayal, fire, and atomic destruction. Chief Engineer Kenichi Yamamoto, recognizing how imperative the success of the rotary engine would be for the company's survival and future, assembled a dedicated team of Mazda's most talented engineers. This team, which would later be known by the legendary nickname the 47 Samurai, in homage to the famous Japanese tale of loyalty and perseverance, was given a single mandate that echoed Jujiro Matsuda's philosophy: solve the unsolvable problem, make the rotary engine work reliably, or die trying. They knew that other automakers from around the world had tried or were currently trying to do exactly what they were attempting, and that none had succeeded. The pressure was immense, almost unbearable. What followed were 6 years of the most intensive engineering effort in Toyo Kogyo's history, 6 years that would determine whether the company survived or collapsed. The rotary engine development team worked around the clock, literally living in the factory for weeks at a time, testing hundreds of different apex seal materials and designs. They tried various metals, ceramics, and composite materials. They experimented with different seal geometries, surface treatments, and lubrication systems. Each iteration brought new data, new insights, and often devastating new disappointments. Seals that worked perfectly for a few hundred kilometers would fail catastrophically after 1,000. Materials that solved one problem created 3 new ones. The dreaded chatter marks kept appearing, mocking their efforts, wearing grooves into prototype after prototype like the nail marks of the devil himself. Then, after countless failures and false starts that would have broken lesser men, the breakthrough finally came. Working closely with partners including Nippon Piston Ring Company and Nippon Oil Seal Company, the engineering team discovered that a specific combination of carbon aluminum materials for the apex seals, combined with extraordinarily precise manufacturing tolerances and a specialized lubrication system, could dramatically extend seal life and prevent the dreaded chatter marks. It wasn't a single eureka moment of inspiration, but rather the culmination of thousands of small discoveries, each building on the last, each pushing them incrementally closer to viability through sheer determination and refusal to surrender. By 1967, after 6 years of obsessive engineering effort that had consumed the lives and marriages of the engineers who worked on it, Toyo Kogyo had accomplished what every expert, every major manufacturer, and every rational analyst had declared absolutely impossible. They had created a reliable, production-ready Wankel rotary engine that could be mass-manufactured and sold to consumers with confidence. And on May 30th, 1967, they introduced to an astonished world the vehicle that would prove it, the Mazda Cosmo Sport. It was a stunning two-door sports coupe with flowing lines and retractable headlights, powered by a twin-rotor engine designated the 10A that produced 110 horsepower from just under 1 liter of displacement, a power density that conventional piston engines of that era simply couldn't match without forced induction. The Cosmo Sport was smooth, fast, sophisticated, and most importantly for Mazda's survival, it actually worked reliably. Journalists who test drove the vehicle were amazed by the rotary engine's silky power delivery, its ability to rev freely to 9,000 RPM without the harsh vibration that characterized even the best piston engines, and the sensation of seemingly endless power that came from the engine's unique power delivery characteristics. The automotive world was forced to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that Toyo Kogyo had achieved something extraordinary that bordered on miraculous. While Detroit's giants were perfecting and refining piston engine designs that dated back to the 19th century, a Japanese company that had started as a cork manufacturer had successfully brought a revolutionary 21st century engine technology to market. The impossible had become possible, and Mazda had become the only manufacturer in history to successfully mass-produce rotary engines. But proving the technology worked in a limited production sports car was just the beginning of Mazda's ambitious plans. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the company aggressively expanded their rotary engine lineup, introducing model after model powered by the revolutionary technology that had consumed 6 years of obsessive development and the dedication of the 47 Samurai. The Familia rotary coupe launched in 1968, bringing rotary power to a more affordable market segment and proving the engine could work in everyday transportation. The legendary RX series followed, with the RX-2, RX-3, and RX-4 establishing Mazda as the world's only manufacturer truly committed to mass-producing rotary engines. While competitors like General Motors and Mercedes-Benz had abandoned the technology as too risky and commercially unviable, Mazda doubled down, pouring resources into refining, improving, and expanding their rotary engine family. Sales climbed steadily throughout the early 1970s as drivers around the world discovered the unique characteristics of rotary power. The smoothness was unlike anything they had experienced in conventional cars. The high revving made driving feel more engaging and responsive. The compact packaging allowed for better weight distribution and improved handling characteristics. Mazda was no longer just another Japanese automaker struggling for recognition in markets dominated by European and American brands. They were the rotary specialists, the company that had solved the impossible problem that had defeated every other manufacturer, and they were reaping substantial rewards for their courage and persistence. Production numbers climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Export markets opened up. The future looked incredibly bright for the company that had risen from cork factory ashes and survived atomic destruction. But then, in October 1973, everything changed in ways that threatened to destroy everything Mazda had built on rotary technology. The oil crisis hit the global economy like a sledgehammer to the skull, and suddenly fuel efficiency became the only metric that mattered to car buyers terrified of gas lines and skyrocketing fuel prices. And here was the cruel irony that threatened to destroy everything Mazda had sacrificed to achieve. Rotary engines, for all their revolutionary advantages in smoothness and power delivery, consumed significantly more fuel than equivalent piston engines. The very compactness and high power output that made them attractive performance engines also made them thirsty, requiring more fuel to produce the same transportation results. Sales of rotary-powered vehicles plummeted overnight as consumers fled in panic to more economical conventional cars. Mazda's stock price collapsed. Financial analysts openly questioned whether the company would survive this crisis. The rotary engine, which had been hailed as the future of automotive propulsion just months earlier, was now being written off as a failed experiment, an engineering curiosity that couldn't adapt to the harsh realities of a fuel-conscious world. Many companies would have cut their losses immediately, abandoned rotary development entirely, and pivoted completely to conventional piston engines to survive. But Mazda's engineers remembered the fundamental lesson that Jujiro Matsuda had taught them decades earlier through his own life. When everyone else sees impossible, you find a way forward. They went back to work with renewed determination, focusing obsessively on improving fuel efficiency, while maintaining the rotary engine's unique performance characteristics that made it special. Simultaneously, they faced another existential threat that compounded their problems: increasingly stringent emissions regulations, particularly America's brutal Muskie Act, which set emission standards that most manufacturers declared impossible to meet without destroying performance. Once again, Mazda's engineers attacked the problem with the relentless determination that had become the company's defining characteristic. They developed an innovative thermal reactor system that burned hydrocarbon residue in the exhaust gas before it could escape into the atmosphere. Against all predictions from competitors who had given up, the rotary engine passed the Muskie Act emissions test, and Mazda successfully began exporting to the United States, one of the world's largest and most profitable automotive markets. They had survived another crisis that should have killed them, proving once again that the spirit of that blacksmith's apprentice who refused to accept defeat was still alive in the company he had founded. Through the 1970s and 80s, as Mazda continued refining their rotary technology and fighting for survival through oil crises and emissions regulations, they made a strategic decision that would ultimately define their legacy and prove to the world that the rotary engine wasn't just viable, it was superior. They would prove the rotary engine's capabilities not just on public roads where fuel efficiency dominated consumer concerns, but on the world's most demanding racetracks where only pure performance, reliability, and engineering excellence mattered. Motorsports became Mazda's laboratory and showcase, a proving ground where rotary engines could demonstrate their true capabilities against the best piston-powered machines from Europe and America. The RX-7, introduced in 1978, became an icon of affordable sports car performance and a dominant force in racing series around the world, winning championships and converting skeptics into believers with every victory. But Mazda had their sights set on something far bigger, far more prestigious, far more audacious than regional racing championships or national series victories. They wanted to conquer the most grueling, most prestigious, most historically significant race in all of motorsports, the ultimate proving ground where automotive legends are born and pretenders are destroyed. The 24 Hours of Le Mans. This wasn't just ambition. This was audacity that bordered on insanity. Le Mans is where machines and drivers are pushed to their absolute limits for an entire day and night without pause. 24 consecutive hours of racing at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, with reliability matching just as much as raw speed. It's a race that had been dominated for decades by European manufacturers with unlimited budgets and decades of racing heritage. Ferrari, Porsche, Jaguar, Mercedes-Benz. American manufacturers had occasionally challenged and even won, but no Japanese manufacturer had ever claimed victory at Le Mans. It was considered the ultimate proof of engineering excellence, and it remained frustratingly, seemingly permanently out of reach for Asian automakers. Mazda developed the 787B, a purpose-built racing prototype that represented everything the company had learned about rotary engines over 3 decades of obsessive development. This wasn't a modified production car with racing parts bolted on. This was a pure racing machine where every single component had been designed and optimized for one singular goal: winning Le Mans and proving rotary engine superiority once and for all. The car was powered by a 4-rotor engine designated the R26B, an engineering masterpiece that produced over 700 horsepower from just 2.6 liters of displacement, a power density that contemporary piston engines couldn't match without turbocharging or supercharging. The car was fast, brutally fast, but Mazda's engineers knew that Le Mans doesn't care about speed alone. The Circuit de la Sarthe demands reliability that can survive 24 hours of punishment, fuel efficiency that can maintain competitive pace without constant refueling stops, and the ability to maintain brutal racing speeds for an entire day and night without catastrophic mechanical failure. June 15th and 16th, 1991. The Circuit de la Sarthe, Le Mans, France. 55 cars from the world's greatest manufacturers lined up on the starting grid under gray French skies. Porsche, the most successful manufacturer in Le Mans history with multiple victories. Jaguar, returning to reclaim former glory. Mercedes-Benz, Peugeot, teams with decades of Le Mans experience and hundreds of millions in development budgets. And then there was Mazda, the company that had started as a cork manufacturer in Hiroshima, powered by an engine technology that every other manufacturer had declared commercially unworkable and abandoned decades earlier. The orange and green Mazda 787B, car number 55, sat on that grid carrying the weight of everything Jujiro Matsuda had believed in, everything the 47 Samurai had sacrificed to achieve, everything that made Mazda different from every other manufacturer on Earth. For 24 hours, the Mazda 787B battled the best machines Europe could throw at it. The distinctive high-pitched scream of the rotary engine, so different from the deep rumble of piston engines, echoed through the French countryside as the car circled the circuit lap after lap, hour after hour, through afternoon heat and midnight darkness and the cold gray dawn. Drivers Johnny Herbert from England, Volker Weidler from Germany, and Bertrand Gachet from Belgium pushed the machine to its limits, while the Mazda pit crew executed flawless pit stops with the precision of a Swiss watch. Competitors fell away one by one with mechanical failures, crashes, strategic mistakes, and the cruel attrition that makes Le Mans the most difficult race on Earth. Porsches retired. Jaguars broke down. Mercedes encountered problems. The favorites were eliminated while the orange and green Mazda kept circulating, kept fighting, kept proving that rotary engines could do what everyone said they couldn't. As dawn broke on June 16, 1991, the orange and green Mazda 787B crossed the finish line in first place, having completed 362 laps covering a distance of 4,923 kilometers. Mazda had done what was considered impossible. A Japanese manufacturer had won Le Mans for the first and so far only time in history. A rotary engine had defeated every piston-powered supercar on the planet. The boy who had left his fishing village to learn blacksmithing, who had built empires from ashes and refused to accept betrayal as defeat, who had bet everything on an engine nobody believed in, his legacy had just conquered the world. From fishing nets to forging steel to the top step of the Le Mans podium, this is the story of Mazda, the company that refused to accept impossible as an answer. And if you've been inspired by this incredible journey from poverty to global triumph, if this story of perseverance and innovation has moved you, then make sure you're subscribed to Motor Chronicles right now, because we're just getting started uncovering the untold stories that shaped the automotive world. The spirit of Jujiro Matsuda lives on today, reminding us that greatness isn't born from privilege or luck, or accepting the limitations others impose. Greatness comes from unbreakable determination and the courage to challenge what everyone else considers impossible. That's the Mazda story. That's the lesson. Now go build your own empire.